Okay, so we're moving towards the close of the semester. Got a few weeks left, and this particular lecture has a lot of stuff in it. So my video lectures will basically be covering section of this for the next couple of weeks. That gives you plenty of time to work on finishing up the paper and then prepping for the study guide, prepping the study guide for the final. So if you think about the final, most of it has to do with the lecture on Islam that covered last week, and then this lecture on basically um, the end of the so-called Dark Ages and moving us to the early modern age. And when I use the term early modern age, we're mostly thinking about the way Western Europe begins to leave its shores, um, especially per the ocean. So, thinking about the Portuguese settling on the west coast of Africa, a place like Senegal, where you have the introduction of modern African slavery and the slave trade is kind of the initial point of early modernity within the scope of the Renaissance. So if you're thinking ahead of like um, this Renaissance period that defines this like increasing movement towards like our contemporary times or the modern age, um, usually I think it's good to start with the idea of like how Europe, through its new technology, is going out into the world trying to find a different route to Asia to do trade. So you have the economic basis there as well. But even how once the movement around Africa happens, and you get toward the end of the 15th century with the voyage of Columbus, that just absolutely rocks the world of the medieval age. And so you have like, if you think about it, here's a medieval map, medieval Christian map of just how they saw the world, and you can obviously see um, they only have the three um, continents represented there because obviously America is not on the radar, doesn't exist in their consciousness. Why do you think it's interesting is how each of the sons of Noah are named after a continent. So you have Shem, Japheth, and Ham. And going back to the comment about slavery, recall that Ham is the quote unquote cursed son by Noah. I mean, if you need to um, read about this in the book of Genesis, there's this whole story about the three sons and that they one is cursed, and there's this whole like um, quote unquote justification among the Europeans to like enslave Africans. So the genesis of that comes actually in this early modern period. So that's the whole idea of Afro-Eurasian network, this pre-modern society. The world's starting to shrink again, basically, and the shrinking is due to a number of different factors that I will talk about in the next few weeks. But that's what I want to put on your radar. When we're talking about medieval structure, particularly in Europe, we're talking about feudalism. So I'll quickly go over here and definitely read about this in your book. But feudalism is that social, economic, political structure. This is seen as given by God. Um, it's a triangle structure. So you think of like you have the top head of the hierarchy with royalty, and then down to basically the nobility. That's including the church, and they're like this warrior class, and then the peasants who pretty much make up the majority of the people who are basically stuck um, on the land to work the land from sun up to sunset. The peasants are there There is no real sense of upward mobility. That is a modern conception that honestly comes mostly from the Renaissance. At least we're talking about Europe. All right. So what about Europe? Last we left Europe, we saw the fall of Rome and then the Christianization of the northern Western European territory by the Catholic Church under Pope Gregory I. So that movement has basically created this kind of Christian setting that needs greater sovereign power, and the church is going to look at Frankish kings for this sovereign power. The figure that gets most attention this way is Charlemagne. So Charlemagne is the king that creates the Carolinian Empire. Um, Again, this is set up to protect Rome, and I use Rome in scare quotes because at this point, the Empire of Rome is no more. What exists is this kind of Christian Roman culture that the Germanic peoples, what is now France, German, Austria, that territory, all that Western European territory, are going to kind of adopt as their own, England by extension. And the Pope is basically going to make a deal with these monarchs of Europe. What you're going to have is this situation where the this figure as emperor, remember, this is kind of a return to the symbol of the Roman Caesar now in these Germanic kings. So you have this emperor figure who has sovereign power over Christendom, the Christian kingdom. This is kind of a unified European idea. And then the Pope, as the Bishop of Rome, which has a special symbolic power because of the ties of Rome to Christianity, but also the ties of Rome to Saint Peter and Saint Paul. The Pope now has these very strong powers of spiritual control. So basically, you have this kind of secular and spiritual control. The secular control in the power of the emperor, and the spiritual control and the power of the papacy. And the papacy needs this physical arm because um, there are kingdoms like the northern Europeans, what we call the Vikings, who begin to attack monasteries and churches because the wealth is found there. And this will lead to the Pope from Charlemagne to Otto the First, um, creating this emperor king figure. Now, history will call this idea of Christendom, or this kingdom that eventually is formed. They'll call it the Holy Roman Empire. Now, Voltaire has this very famous saying that deserves to be repeated. He basically says, like, it definitely wasn't holy, it definitely wasn't Roman, and it definitely wasn't an empire. And that's pretty true. There's already holes in this kingdom at the get go, and probably the biggest problem with it is how the Pope and the Emperor oftentimes challenge each other for like ultimate authority. So they're constantly at a tug of war with each other, and we'll see later on this becomes a big issue. But already, and you need to know this for your test, in the 11th century, there's already this big controversy on who has the authority to choose each other's position. Because at this point, the emperor wants to be able to like pick popes and pick high officials like archbishops and cardinals. And the church decides, no way. In the investor controversy, they're going to create the situation where the church alone can pick the pope, and so that continues even into this day. There's a really like fun movie that came out recently about the two popes. It's highly fictional on non-fictional characters, but it shows some of the ins and outs of how they pick the pope, and I think that was really fascinating. Um, so, what about these extraordinary powers the papacy has taken on? Well, for starters, um, there is the Eastern Christian Church. This is what we refer to as Eastern Orthodoxy or just Orthodoxy. It's existed. It's been around with the um, Roman Empire in Constantinople. Remember the eastern section of Roman Empire that's still in existence. That Constantine had it flourished under him, and then later on Justinian. What about that church? Well, there is a breakdown, mostly having to do with this issue of power. So the breakdown is a result of the Pope taking on extraordinary powers over the church, and that's kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. Now, ultimately, the schism, this break between the Eastern Church, which is Greek speaking, and the Western Church, which now is based around Latin. Um, this happened in 1054. Now, this schism still exists today. I mean, there has been like conversation between the two, but ultimately, there's still a break between these two global churches, and it mostly has to do with this power issue. Now, this will be fascinating to think about, especially as you move into the Crusades, and one of the reasons, um, the motivations for Western European Christians to go into the Middle East to liberate the Eastern Kingdom and fight against Muslims. So we'll pick that up in the next lecture.